What's up and welcome into the top 10 must-know traps for every chess player. I'm sure you're familiar with a few of them, but I'm also sure that some of these traps will be an interesting surprise for you, and definitely you gotta be aware of them all. We're kicking off with the first trap, which happens in the Caro-Kann Defense. Here the main move is knight to c3, but you may surprise your opponent with the move bishop to d3, which also makes sense. It's a development move protecting the pawn. And the trap here is, if black goes knight to f6 here, developing their knight, then it's actually a pretty big mistake, because here you go pawn to e5, attacking the knight, and your opponents will most frequently go with their knight to d7 right here, because they can't really go forward with the knight. If it goes forward, then you just capture the knight by playing pawn to f3, and the knight is captured right here. It has no squares to escape. Therefore, this just doesn't work for black. Let's take a move back. Instead, they'll much likely to move their knight to d7, but here you have this blockading sacrifice pawn to e6. And after they capture, you're happily delivering this check, queen h5, and after pawn to g6, a common sacrifice, queen takes g6, followed by bishop takes g6, a beautiful checkmate. While the first trap was rather simple, the next one is more advanced, and you can trap even very experienced opponents just like that. The trap here is you're going pawn to a6, and it's hard to believe that a move like that can actually set a trap, but it is truly the case. Usually, in the vast majority of the cases in the Sicilian defense, at this point white goes pawn to d4 if black plays any other move instead of pawn to a6. And that is why the majority of your opponents will actually still go pawn to d4 right here, even though in this particular case it is a mistake. And if they go pawn to d4, you capture here, and then you go knight to f6. It develops a knight, attacks the pawn, and also sets the first trap. If white plays pawn to e5, which looks like a really tempting option to attack your knight, to drive it away, in this case, instead of moving your knight, you just go queen to a5 check with a double attack to the white's king and the pawn, thus winning the pawn on the next move. And therefore, that is the first trap that you've got here. Now, if your opponent is smart enough not to play the move pawn to e5, let's take a move back, and instead they go knight to c3. Fairly standard move, right? Then you go pawn to e5 to drive away the knight, and after it goes back, you go bishop b4, which is another interesting moment for you where you are likely to win a number of games. By playing knight to f3, white seemingly attacked your pawn on e5, and you played bishop b4, kind of overlooking the opponent's threat. But the thing is, if white actually goes ahead and captures the pawn, you continue with queen to e7, and it turns out that you get back this pawn on the e4 on the next move, while also creating a whole bunch of problems for white. For example, if white goes knight d3 or any other square, you capture this knight, knight takes e4, and now look at this, you've got the opposition of your king towards the white's your queen towards the white's king. Also, you're putting pretty strong pressure towards the white's knight, which is pinned, and all in all, it can get really dangerous for white. For example, if they just capture your bishop, then you capture their knight on c3, and notice that it is a discovered check as well as attack of the white's queen. Therefore, you'll grab the queen on the next move and win the game. We just analyzed one of the pitfalls in this line. If white is greedy and is trying to capture a pawn on e5, they get in trouble. Now, they still need to do something here about the central pawns, because you're also still threatening to capture the white's pawn on e4, taking advantage of this pin. And therefore, your opponents are also likely to go bishop d3 just to protect the pawn and develop the bishop. In this case, you go pawn on d5, which creates the final trap. In this case, the vast majority of your opponents will go ahead and capture the pawn on d5, just because that's how players typically react to the central pawn advancement. They capture it. Also, you're threatening pawn on d4, or maybe capture here, and it's very likely that while it is going to capture here, expecting you to recapture with the knight, and after that there is a normal game of chess. But that is the point where, first of all, you can do something like this.
Oh, haha.
And after that, instead of capturing the pawn, you go pawn to e4. You don't want a pawn, you want to win one of their pieces, either a bishop or the knight. And if white tries to capture the pawn, it doesn't work because you recapture, and because of the pin, they cannot grab your knight here, thus you won a piece, plus you're still having this pressure along this diagonal, and you're getting a totally winning position. A really cool line by black. As you may notice here, there are a number of ways for white to lose the game really quickly, and even very experienced opponents up to the level of masters and occasionally grandmasters actually lose the games like this. That's how you can win a number of games playing Sicilian Defense as black. And if you're wondering how you can trap your opponents while you're playing white against Sicilian Defense, then you may check out my other video, 5 best opening traps for Blitz and Bullet, where I also share a couple of really cool traps in the Sicilian Defense for white. And I'll provide a link to that video also below the video and here on the screen. The next trap happens in the Dutch defense. Here we go, bishop g5, and even though this trap is really old, a lot of players still fall victims of this trap. They go here after your bishop, they're trying to capture it, they play pawn to g5 and then pawn to f4, and at first it looks like black just captured your bishop right here on g3 because it has no way to escape, but there is a trick here. You go pawn to e3 firstly, and it allows your queen to aim for that h5 square, and from there it's going to checkmate the opponent's king, and therefore black doesn't have any time to capture your bishop. At this point they may realize that they're actually in trouble, but still they may try to play pawn to h5, insisting on their idea to somehow capture your bishop, because for example, if you just capture the pawn here, they can still continue with pawn to h4 and still insist on capturing your bishop, and the position remains very unclear. But instead of capturing that pawn, there are a lot of other things that you can do. While probably bishop to e2 attacking that pawn is the best move, but bishop d3 is just cool, because here you're threatening checkmate in one, bishop g6, and if they go rook to h6 trying to cover that square, then you've got a beautiful follow-up, queen takes h5 check, followed by bishop to g6 checkmate. The next one is kind of funny, it's kind of counter trap. I noticed that in this position, after you go knight to f3, quite a number of players play bishop to c5, somehow believing that white cannot capture the pawn here. And the fun fact, a lot of players actually don't take it. In the vast majority of the cases, white actually goes bishop c4 right here, just continuing symmetric development. Well, you certainly shouldn't be afraid of taking that pawn. You can win the pawn for nothing. And again, for the reasons that I'm not aware of, a lot of players somehow believe that knight takes e5 is a bad move because black can somehow attack you here. But in reality, if they try executing these tactical ideas, sacrificing the bishop and playing queen to h4, there are in fact a number of ways for you to handle this. One of them, probably the most powerful one, is to play pawn to g3. And after queen takes e4, at first it looks like they're attacking here, a whole bunch of stuff. You go here, first of all, queen to e2, letting them capture the rook, and after that, even more so, you play bishop g2, asking them to capture something else in your position, because the thing is, you're preparing a discovered attack with your knight here. And regardless of what black captures here, for example, they capture the pawn on h2, in this case, you deliver the discovered check like this. So the black's king is checked, and here you're going to capture the queen on the next move. Or if I take a move back here for black, and instead of capturing the pawn here, if black's queen would decide to capture your bishop on c1, then you deliver the discovered check from another side, you go knight d3, and the idea is still the same. The black's king is under the check, therefore black has to cover the king, and then you grab the queen. It's a really interesting line, and like I said, a lot of players of black somehow are not aware of this. They believe that they can go into this line, but in fact, you can win the game just like this. And the next trap is one of my most favorite ones. It starts with the classical moves, and at this point, instead of going bishop c4 or bishop b5, which are usual options, you go bishop to e2. And such a modest looking move looks like just a bit of a passive option for white, but in fact, it's a really dangerous one, because a lot of your opponents will go bishop c5. And in this position, most players just castle, they don't know what to do, but there is a powerful shot, knight takes e5. It's not really the sacrifice, because after black captures, you go pawn to d4, regaining the material balance just on the next move. But on top of that, if black captures here, which is something they do very frequently, you recapture, and here, all of a sudden black realizes that they have some problems along this diagonal. And if they try to keep the knight there on e5, you still push it away by playing pawn to f4, and after the knight goes back, you happily capture that pawn on g7, winning the pawn, attacking here the rook, potentially the knight there, and all in all, getting a winning position. A really cool variation which starts off really classically, kind of passively, but then all of a sudden creates so huge problems for black. While the line I just shown you is good for some occasional blitz games, of course, I would not recommend that you make it your main opening weapon and you play it against experienced opponents. For those cases, I would recommend that you study a pretty simple but yet aggressive line bishop to c4, the bishop's opening, and I'll link to my other video where I analyze this opening variation. It's pretty short, and just within some 15 minutes you can learn how to play it and you'll get a really solid opening weapon, so you may like to check that video as well. The next trap is one of the most classical ones, and yet it occurs in different openings, and therefore definitely gotta know this opening motif. Here in this Caro-Kann defense position, instead of going knight g5 or knight f3 or whatever, white may play queen to e2 to set a clever trap, and if black goes knight to f6, then all of a sudden their king is checkmated right in the center of the board, just with the white's knight. Even though it's a classical trap, there were tens if not hundreds of people who were trapped like this, even in official tournaments. And here's a more advanced version of a similar idea, which occurs in the Benko Gambit here after pawn on b5. And in this case, the usual move for white is just accepting the gambit, but you can go knight to c3, and after black captures, playing pawn to e4. And at first it looks like you're overlooking the black's idea, kicking your knight away, and after that grabbing the pawn on e4. But in fact, you're aiming for a similar setup of pieces. You go queen e2, attacking that knight, and once it goes back, you deliver a similar checkmate knight to d6. All in all, you can see that it's a common idea which works in different openings, and therefore it's just really useful to know this tactical motif. Alright, we've got just a few more traps to cover, and I wonder, by the way, if you're familiar with all these traps or if you learned anything new today. Let me know in the comments below if you learned anything interesting. And the next one is a really classical one, and yet again it works. I myself executed it a couple times in my blitz games. So here you go bishop c4 instead of the more common move pawn to d4. And a lot of players can't help but go bishop g4 just because amateur players love this pin so much that they can't refrain from putting their bishop right there. And in this case, it's just important to notice that you gotta play pawn to h3 first. You cannot go for that sacrifice right away, because in this case black can just recapture and this knight protects the bishop and white's idea just fails right away. Therefore, instead of taking there right away, it's important that you play pawn to h3 first, kicking the bishop away. They'll go bishop h5, and right here it works just perfectly. You take knight takes e5. In this case, recapturing the knight doesn't work because then you can grab their bishop on h5. Therefore, in this case, it's all good. And if they grab your queen, which is the main motif of this legal checkmate, then you go for bishop takes f7, king e7, knight d5. Beautiful checkmate with a couple of minor pieces in the center of the board. We've got two more traps to cover, and this one is a really cool one. I trapped people like this myself, and I also have to confess that once I was trapped myself in a blitz game. I just played the wrong move. It works against Alekhine's defense, which happens after knight to f6, or against the Scandinavian defense, pawn on d5, because they can lead to the same position. In this case, if you capture, the main move for black is knight to f6, and here you can go knight to c3, black recapture, and you go bishop c4, attacking the knight. It may go back, attacking your bishop. You go here bishop b3, black plays knight to c6 at this point, and you go knight f3. Again, it looks like just both players are developing their pieces, a standard game of chess, and again, a lot of your opponents will play here bishop to g4, just because it looks active, looks cool to pin your knight, but in this case you've got a very common tactical motif. You first of all sacrifice the bishop here, winning the pawn, and after they recapture, you go knight g5. Which is a check to the black's king, and on the next move you grab the bishop back, and therefore along this variation you won that pawn on f7, and not only that, you weakened the opponent's king significantly. For example, right now you're even threatening just checkmate in one, queen to e6. Therefore, not only you won a pawn, you're also getting a great attacking position here, thus getting a winning game. And there's one more trap against another version of the Scandinavian defense. In case black captures that pawn on d5 with a queen, we just analyzed their move knight to f6 here previously, and what if they capture? In this case, you go knight c3, and if they move their queen back to d8, there is another cool line. You go knight f3, knight f6, and bishop c4. And in this case, again, a lot of your opponents will play bishop g4. It's a common move in Scandinavian defense and in general, and in this case, I'd like to ask you to think about this position and to let me know how would you play here as white. if you find the following idea yourself, you will actually remember it better and you will actually execute it in your games. So please think about it and write it down in the comments below. How would you play here as white? I hope that you enjoyed all of these traps and are going to use them in your own practical games. I'll link to the other videos that I mentioned below the video, and maybe some I'll show on the screen. Also, you may wish to check out my free masterclass, The Best Way to Improve at Chess Instantly, by clicking the link on the screen, and there you'll just see in general how to progress in chess and what are the most efficient ways. I hope you'll have a great time playing chess, and I'll talk to you soon.